This is my 90th video on my work with OO gauge. See part 1 of this series for my reasons for getting into OO gauge when I already had a lot invested in working in N gauge and I didn't really have space available for a large, fully operational OO gauge layout. Also see my lengthy series on my N gauge railway modelling for smaller and more complex scenery and smaller scale trains running. This part is back to scenic items for my Hornby layout, specifically building up, populating, painting and placing some outdoor tables from the P&D Marsh white metal kit and the Metcalfe card kit. Back in part 79 I previewed some things that I just brought back from British model trains in Cambridge, Ontario. The other items there have already arrived on the layout. The old locos have been featured in several videos and the greenhouses were built up, finished and placed in part 85. So now I'm finally getting round to these items, P&D Marsh and Metcalfe kits for outdoor tables, which I bought with the intention of filling out the centre section of my Hornby layout a bit. I bought 2 of these P&D Marsh white metal kits, each of which is supposed to build a table with an umbrella, 2 chairs and 2 seated figures. It was probably just as well that I bought 2 of these kits, as if I had only had the first one that I opened I would have been a bit confused. That first kit, the assemblage of parts seen at left here, was quite incomplete. By comparison with the other kit, which was complete, it was possible to clarify what was missing. The figures and the table were there, and there were also 2 chair backs, but one of the chair seats was missing, and both sets of chair legs were missing. That kit also came with no instructions of any kind. The instructions at back here came from the second complete kit. I could see that maybe the small metal parts that were missing might have somehow fallen through a hole in the bag or something, but there was no way that the instructions could have fallen out, so clearly they simply weren't packed in the first place. I'm afraid this isn't the first problem I've had with P&D Marsh kits. Their quality control seems to be a bit slapdash. Given how basically crude most of these parts are, it seems simpler just to fabricate something to replace the missing bits rather than bothering to try to complain and get replacement parts from the manufacturer. On the right here is one of the white metal parts for a chair seat, and on the left a replacement seat I cut from cardboard. I replaced the missing chair legs with pieces cut from ratio plastic fencing. Here are the 2 chairs built from the incomplete kit using my replacement parts. They look pretty awful now, but once they're painted I don't think the difference will be very noticeable. Ironically, whilst I was trying to assemble the chairs from the complete kit, the legs for one of the chairs popped out of my tweezers and I couldn't find them for the life of me, so I ended up having 3 chairs with replacement legs, 2 due to the manufacturer's emissions and 1 due to losing the part myself. The tables at least were complete and were assembled just by sticking legs to the bottom after suitably filing things down to shape. So there are 4 chairs and 2 tables, a bit wonky but moving in the right direction. Brass rod was provided for the umbrella poles. For some reason one kit had a rod much thicker than the other. The poles needed to be cut to length. At this point I spray painted everything a dull brown, tending to hide much of the inconsistency. I detached the parts from where I'd stuck them down for painting. Next I needed to do the figures. P&D Marsh castings tend to be quite crude and a fair bit of work with knife and file is needed to remove unwanted metal and approximate things to the correct shape. I tried OO Bill's suggestion and used my helping hand to hold the figures as I painted them. I painted the women's dresses first, then some flesh colour for faces and arms. She looks a bit of a nightmare here in a clear flash picture, but I don't think she'll look too bad from a distance on the layout. I can't really do much when it comes to painting detail on tiny OO gauge figures. Here's one of the gentlemen. And here's the other. Again, my attempt to shade the eye sockets didn't really work. The P&D Marsh kit provided the umbrellas as metal parts. Indeed, they were the largest and probably the best cast parts in the kits. I started by painting the whole top of each umbrella yellow. Then I used a fine brush to paint alternate segments in blue and red, a fiddly job which I did with only moderate success. Then I glued the poles of the tables to the umbrellas using CA glue, as usual for these white metal kits. I glued the figures to the chairs. So there's the whole of the two P&D Marsh kits basically finished. I placed these tables and the seated figures into the patio area of the village cafe, which was built from the Metcalfe Village Shop and Cafe kit, see part 46. It was rather a squeeze as there wasn't much room on that patio and I had to overlap the right-hand table over the wall to get it to fit. Next I wanted to build the Metcalf tables, but they didn't come with any figures and I didn't want to just have empty tables, so I turned back to these Slater's unpainted plastic seated figures, some of which I'd used before, mainly for vehicle drivers. The Slater's set includes 3 sprues, all the same, each with 7 individual figures and 1 couple. I cut out the best selection of figures I could come up with to go with these tables. I left some sprue on the figures to make holding them for painting easier. I took those figures down to spray paint initial colours on them, so they'll come back a bit later. Here's the Metcalf mini kit for the picnic tables. This is what the kit contained. None of the usual Metcalf printed card parts, in fact. 2 sheets of laser cut parts, a paper sheet for umbrellas, and a small folded sheet of instructions. There was also a sheet of clear acetate, but since there's nothing to glaze in this kit, I assume this was simply part of the packaging. Here's one side of the instruction sheet opened out. Since the instructions are intended to function as a little booklet, what you're seeing here is effectively pages 1 and 4. And here's the other side of the instructions showing pages 2 and 3. The first thing to do is to glue together bottom and top pieces to make the tabletops. The top pieces have the planking detail and the bottom pieces make slots for attaching the legs. It was quite fiddly gluing the parts of this kit together, as the parts are very small and the rocket card glue fixes the laser cut material quite rapidly, so you don't have much time to adjust the alignment of the parts before the glue fixes them in place. The seats for the circular table also need to be made by gluing top and bottom pieces together. These were really tiny and so particularly challenging to align properly before the glue gripped. The seats for the rectangular tables came as parts that were supposed to be folded over and glued. But they really didn't want to fold. Even after I cut the folding grooves deeper with a knife, I still had to clamp them to get them to stay folded. The legs for the circular table also needed to be folded and glued. I eased the folds first. These folded much more easily as the lengths to be folded were much smaller. The problem with these was that they didn't align very naturally when they were folded and had to be forced into alignment before the glue gripped. Once folded and glued, these legs need to be glued into the grooves on the bottom of the circular tabletop, taking care to push them out hard against the outer end of the groove to keep the centre hole free for an umbrella pole. Again, quite fiddly with small parts, and getting the legs straight before the glue sets is basically on you. Although I suppose ultimate precision isn't entirely necessary, and when you've got all 4 legs on, they sort of tend to line themselves up. The legs for the rectangular tables don't fold, you just need to glue 2 parts together for each set of legs. Again, I didn't do a great job of getting alignment perfect, fiddly as I say with such small, hard-to-handle parts. Those legs then glue into the grooves under the tabletop, again trying to keep them straight as far as possible, and there's no brace between them or anything to help keep them straight. The seats for the circular table each have only 1 support in the middle. This makes it quite tricky to get them to stay level. I would have thought that this would also be a stupid design in real life. If a fat person sat on one end of such a seat, it would most likely break. The seats for the rectangular tables are better, sensibly supported at both ends, and so naturally sitting level, and obviously much stronger. So there are the 3 tables that this kit builds, all assembled. The instructions for the umbrellas are on the umbrella sheet rather than being included in the instruction booklet. Lots of printed paper umbrellas are provided, but you're on your own so far as providing poles for the umbrellas. I cut out one of the umbrellas, fiddly work with the tip of a sharp knife. Then you need to score all of the fold lines, fold the umbrella up and glue the tab underneath to hold it together. I cut poles from suitable diameter piano wire, something I tend to keep on hand as it's useful for many things. I glued the umbrella to the top of the pole with rocket glue. The pole for the circular table fitted nicely as the legs make a kind of tube that keeps it vertical. On the other hand, the poles for the rectangular tables were just passing through a hole in the thin tabletop and so didn't really have anything much to hold them vertical. I did my best to glue them in place with CA glue. And I cut more umbrellas. I tried to edge with a marker, but it bled a bit. I did the best I could with these paper umbrellas. And there are the 3 tables with their umbrellas. Now I brought the Slater's seated figures back from initial spray painting. I did my best to complete the figures by painting details with a fine brush. And then I finally cut them from their sprues. I touched up the shoes of the figures after cutting them from the sprues, then I glued them to seats. I figured this was necessary as I'd never be able to place them properly otherwise. I found a couple of standing children that I had from before to make a family group with a couple of the figures. Real train going by outside. I put the circular table beside the cafe. I sat the figures on this facing outward as I thought they looked better that way. So here's the cafe with tables from both sets. I put the other tables behind the railway hotel. Here's the family group beside one table. I put the lovers on their own on the other table, a bit hard to get the camera to focus on them. But perhaps a little soft focus isn't such a bad thing. So there's a final view of both tables behind the railway hotel. I do still have more scenic work to do on the Hornby layout. The next thing that I want to do there is to resurface the schoolyard and then to fit some play equipment there and add some children and teachers. But I'm also proceeding with my shelf layout. Probably the next step will be to test the electronic shuttle controllers. And then I'll try to put up the back scene. Rather dreading doing that, but obviously I need to do my best with it before going any further with actually laying track on the shelves. And I do have lots of rolling stock I'd like to work with when I have time, so I've got plenty to work on in this bleak midwinter. And as I say, it's always summer on my layouts.